In the next part of Chapter 5 of Counsels and Maxims on the ages of life, Schopenhauer contrasts youth with maturity, the first half of our life with the second half. He concludes with, I think, a really interesting metaphor about the difference between the way things seem to us in youth and in age. Here's what he writes. In the bright dawn of our youthful days, the poetry of life spreads out a gorgeous vision before us, and we torture ourselves by longing to see it realized. We might as well wish to grasp the rainbow. The youth expects his career to be like an interesting romance, and there lies the germ of that disappointment which I have been describing. What lends a charm to all these visions is just the fact that they are visionary and not real, and that in contemplating them we are in the sphere of pure knowledge, which is sufficient in itself and free from the noise and struggle of life. To try and realize those visions is to make them an object of will, a process which always involves pain. Schopenhauer's footnote. Let me refer the reader, if he is interested in the subject, to the volume already cited, chapter 37, and that's volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation, chapter 37. Perhaps I'll do a video on that in the future. So what Schopenhauer said here so far, in our youthful days, we have great visions of the future, and insofar as those are purely objects of intellectual contemplation and knowledge, they're just fine. But to make them objects of the will, to long for them, to attempt to achieve them, to want them, in a sense, that's where pain comes in. That's where we begin to suffer. That's where our suffering starts. And this fits with the whole idea of the diminishment of the will being the key to a happy, or at least a less miserable life. Schopenhauer goes on. If the chief feature of the earlier half of life is a never satisfied longing for happiness, the latter half is characterized by the dread of misfortune. For as we advance in years, it becomes in a greater or less degree clear that all happiness is chimerical in nature, and that pain alone is real. Accordingly, in later years, we, or at least the more prudent amongst us, are more intent upon eliminating what is painful from our lives and making our position secure than on the pursuit of positive pleasure. I may observe, by the way, that in old age we are better able to prevent misfortunes from coming, and in youth better able to bear them when they come. So, an observation here, one which we might compare to our own experience. Is it the case that as we grow older, especially as we get to be my age and older, that we more and more seek to avoid pain to eliminate misfortune and therefore acquire a kind of security rather than to achieve a sort of positive pleasure? Schopenhauer is mapping this onto his vision that we gradually realize that the reality of this world is that pain is real, pleasure is illusory. What we call pleasure, what we enjoy, is really just the release from pain. And so we shift from trying to achieve the object of our desire to simply trying to eliminate sources of pain and discomfort and unpleasantness within our lives. And this accounts for the way in which, as people age, they become more security-minded. So, going on with Schopenhauer now. In my young days, I was always pleased to hear a ring at my door. Ah, thought I, now for something pleasant. But in later life, my feelings on such occasions were rather akin to dismay than to pleasure. Heaven help me, thought I, what am I to do? A similar revulsion of feeling in regard to the world of men takes place in all persons of any talent or distinction. For that very reason, they cannot be said properly to belong to the world. In greater or less degree, according to the extent of their superiority, they stand alone. In their youth, they have a sense of being abandoned by the world, but later on they feel as though they had escaped it. The earlier feeling is an unpleasant one, and rests upon ignorance. The second is pleasurable, for in the meantime they have come to know what the world is. Interesting paragraph here, right? Schopenhauer saying, when I heard the doorbell ring when I was young, what new pleasant thing awaits me? I hear the same doorbell ring when I'm old. I think, what am I to do? How am I to escape this imposition upon me? His suggestion here, he's not really arguing for this so much as simply observing it or claiming it, is that all people of any kind of superior quality or intellect will feel just this way, that they don't belong in the world, that the world's demands upon them are a kind of intrusion from which they would like to escape. So that the young man feels abandoned by the world, the older man feels that he's escaped the world. Okay, so the young man is unhappy because he feels the world owes him more. The old man knows that that's simply not the case at all, that as much detachment as he can get is something to be valued. I think here of the conversation between Socrates and I think it was Cephalus in the or Chaerephon, get the two mixed up, in Book One of Republic, where Socrates asks him what's the greatest benefit of being old, and part of the old man's response is, I feel my libido has gone down, and I feel like I've been released from a terrible and cruel master. So the sense in which having fewer desires to be satisfied, being released from the sort of passionate, hot-blooded drive to satisfy these desires, that itself is a source of consolation and even of what might pass for happiness in Schopenhauer's universe. So going on now. The consequence of this is that, as compared with the earlier, the later half of life, like the second part of a musical period, has less of passionate longing and more restfulness about it. And why is this the case? Simply because, in youth, a man fancies that there is a prodigious amount of happiness and pleasure to be had in the world, only that it is difficult to come by it. Whereas, when he becomes old, he knows that there is nothing of the kind. He makes his mind completely at ease on the matter, enjoys the present hour as well as he can, and even takes pleasure in trifles. The chief result gained by experience of life is clearness of view. This is what distinguishes a man of mature age, and makes the world wear such a different aspect from that which it presented in his youth or boyhood. It is only then that he sees things quite plain, and takes them for that which they really are. While in earlier years he saw a phantom world, put together out of the whims and crotchets of his own mind, inherited prejudice and strange delusion, the real world was hidden from him, or the vision of it distorted. The first thing that experience finds to do is to free us from the phantoms of the brain, those false notions that have been put into us in youth. So here's two paragraphs on the way in which experience tears away the phantom world in which we live as a child. So we become programmed with the idea that the world has a great deal to offer us, that we can achieve pleasure. There's great pleasures to be had. We just have to exert ourselves to attain them. And if we don't attain them, it is because of some kind of fault or flaw. We haven't reached far enough. We haven't worked hard enough. We've been somehow denied or oppressed. But the reality is, there never was any such pleasure available. This is what the old man realizes, and this is what experience clears away, the sort of the phantoms of the mind that we inherit from our youth. They dissipate, and then we're able to take pleasure in trifles, to enjoy the moment, right, without the striving of will, which characterizes the younger man. Schopenhauer goes on. To prevent their entrance at all would, of course, be the best form of education. That is the entrance of these phantoms. Even though it were only negative in aim. But it would be a task full of difficulty. At first, the child's horizon would have to be limited as much as possible, and yet within that limited sphere none but clear and correct notions would have to be given. Only after the child had properly appreciated everything within it might the sphere be gradually enlarged, care being taken always that nothing was left obscure or half or wrongly understood. The consequence of this training would be that the child's notions of men and things would always be limited and simple in their character, but, on the other hand, they would be clear and correct, and only need to be extended, not to be rectified. The same line might be pursued on into the period of youth. This method of education would lay special stress upon the prohibition of novel reading, and the place of novels would be taken by suitable biographical literature, the life of Franklin, for instance, or Moritz's Anton Reiser. It's kind of interesting here. This almost looks like a kind of Schopenhauer's version of the program of education from Plato's Republic. How could we ideally program or shape our children so that they should be correctly oriented to the world as typically only an old man could be? Well, we would have to limit the range of, we'd have to prevent these phantoms from coming into their minds in the first place by leaving nothing obscure, by sharply limiting their horizon, but giving them only clear and correct notions of men. Schopenhauer had no children of his own, and I cannot imagine that he means this really as a practical scheme, but perhaps more to say that this is what you would have to do, most especially no novels. Novels feed the imagination, they feed this longing for a different sort of life, or for any sort of life at all. Going on now. In our early days, we fancy that the leading events in our life, and the persons who are going to play an important part in it, will make their entrance to the sound of drums and trumpets. But when in old age we look back, we find that they all came in quite quietly, slipped in, as it were, by the side door, almost unnoticed. This is a nice kind of observation that we might expect that meeting our spouse or meeting people who will be quite significant for us, they would appear sort of with this sort of youthful enthusiasm. We might imagine that they would appear with the sound of trumpets and drums, or when I meet my future spouse, I'll know that she's the one. I'll just sort of feel it. And what we'll find as an old man looking back, that the main characters of your life sort of entered by the side door of the stage. They didn't come on in a great procession. This seems to me that there's a great deal of truth in that. Last paragraph of this part. From the point of view we have been taking up until now, life may be compared to a piece of embroidery, of which, during the first half of his time, a man gets a sight of the right side, and during the second half of the wrong. The wrong side is not so pretty as the right, but it is more instructive. It shows the way in which the threads have been worked together. That's the end of the passage I'm going to read for today. And I don't have any embroidery with me, but I do have something similar that one of my daughters made many years ago. This is a little plastic canvas thing from 2013 that one of my girls made for me. And it has, as Schopenhauer suggested here, both a front and a back side. The front side looks quite pretty. It's a set of buildings, some numbers, some pink clouds. Okay, quite nice looking. The back, where all the work has been done, not quite so nice looking, right? You see the stitching here. It's not pretty the way that the front is, but it does show you where the threads were crossed over and tied and how the work was done. This is Schopenhauer's comparison. The first half of life, we see the front half of the embroidery. The second half, we see the back side of the embroidery, which is not so pretty, but which is instructive. We see how the threads fit together. So I like this perhaps as much as the metaphor in the previous section about the scenery of a stage play, which you see first from far away and it looks impressive, and then later from closer up and you see it as it truly is. So a little bit deeper metaphor here from Schopenhauer. So that's the second of the several sections that I'm breaking up the ages of life into. We'll take a look at a third section in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.